Great Rising Grasshoppers. I'm so glad that you could come back and join me for my social studies class. My name is Ma'ati Tanetter, and I am a teacher at Denton Magnet School of Technology. Today, we are going to continue with Chapter 13, the Civil Rights Movement. Now, last week, we focused on the desegregation of public facilities such as schools, transportation, and lunch counters. Now, today, our focus will be on the roles of these two presidents during this time period. Now, our first president is President John F. Kennedy and his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. We will also highlight on different opinions on the civil rights movement. Now, if you have your packet, make sure that you have the one that is labeled Section 2, the Civil Rights Movement. There are 3 pages. So go ahead and get that out. Or if you just want to listen and get your notes later, you can get this program on YouTube, but give it about maybe a 12-hour loop before you go to it. So do whatever it is that you feel like you need to do. If you just have some paper and you want to jot down some notes, that's fine too. All right. Now, our 2 critical standards that we are going to be looking at today is standard number 9, critique major social and cultural changes in the United States since World War II, and number 12, recognize domestic issues that shaped the United States since World War II. Last week, I failed to tell you what critique means. My apologies. So this week, I am going to tell you this. Critique is a French word, and it means to evaluate a theory or practice in a detailed and analytical way. Now, that's where we get the words critic, criticize, and critical. So just as a FYI, that's what critique means. We're evaluating, we're passing judgment on that. All right, now before we get into this, we're going to do a little bell ringer, or we're going to get your dendrites going. That's your brain cells. All right, if you were there, you are a civil rights activist living and working in the South. It is 1960, a presidential year. The battle for fair treatment has been difficult, and you hope that the next president will support civil rights. Both major presidential candidates will be visiting your area soon, and you might have a chance to meet them and ask some questions. What questions would you ask the candidates? I'll give you a second or two to think about that. Now, during election years like this one, whether it is local, state, or federal, you might hear the word platform a lot. And no, that does not refer to a type of shoe. In politics, a platform is basically a set of goals that a candidate hopes to accomplish if that candidate is elected to that office. One of the questions that you might ask this candidate, if you were a civil rights activist in the 1960s, might be, what is your plan for supporting civil rights? How do you plan on supporting civil rights? You might ask them that. But a lot of times, and it doesn't matter what the candidate is running for, the overreaching question is, what are you going to do for my community if I cast my vote for you? What's in it for me? And that's what every candidate has to answer at some point. All right? So this is where we are. The name of our section is Kennedy, Johnson, and Civil Rights. And the essential question is this. How did the civil rights movement advance under the presidencies of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson? Now, at this point in the nation's history, some progress had been made through the courts and public protests, but some people felt like progress was too slow. And more needed to be done. They were kind of frustrated with that. So under these 2 presidents, the civil rights movement gained more support on the federal level. So we're going to go to the key terms. And the first one is, well, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. That's what the F stands for. He was the U.S. president elected in 1960. The Freedom Rides, a series of protests in which black and white passengers tried to integrate Southern bus stations. The March on Washington, massive civil rights demonstration in 1963, and Lyndon B. Johnson, U.S. president after Kennedy was assassinated. Our second group of key terms, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banned segregation and workplace discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, law protecting African Americans' voting rights. Great Society, Johnson's program to end poverty and racial injustice. Black Power, movement that called for African American power and independence. And Malcolm X, leader who combined ideas about independence with the teachings of Islam. All right, so now it is 1960. We have a brand new president in the White House. Before President Kennedy was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he was involved in the desegregation of Central High School. We talked about that last week. So now we have a new president. Now, a couple of FYIs about Kennedy. He was the youngest president elected at 43. Now, our youngest president total was Theodore Roosevelt. He came into the office, I want to say at 39, but he was the youngest one that was elected. He was Irish Catholic, and his wife, Jackie, there she is in the pink, compared his administration to Camelot, which is a mythical world ruled by King Arthur where goodness reigned supreme. And at the time, this was the president's favorite Broadway musical. He grew up very rich in Massachusetts, and he went to Harvard University. He was also, he served in the Navy. And another FYI, he was sickly as a child, and he had suffered with back issues for a good part of his life. So those are a couple of FYIs about this new president. Now, John F. Kennedy, he did support civil rights during his campaign. And as a result, a lot of African Americans did cast their vote for him. But once he got into office, he kind of slowed down the process of moving toward, more advances towards civil rights. One of the reasons why is because he did not want to lose the support of the Congress, because he had some other ideas that were a part of his New Frontier program, and that included the space program, aid for the poor, and increased wages. So he was supportive of civil rights, but he was he moved kind of slow on that because he did want to keep the support of his congressional members. But meanwhile, the fight still continues. Now, at this particular time, bus stations like Greyhound and Trailways, the buses that traveled from state to state, they were interstate transportation, they stayed segregated, even though the Supreme Court had ruled that this was unconstitutional. Remember Brown versus Board of Education last week? Yeah, that was a carryover from that. So as a result, there were some civil rights groups that organized protests that included a protest that were called freedom rides. So we have groups like CORE, and CORE stands for the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, and they stand for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So they organized protests, and their protests were they would ride from the north to the south to challenge these segregated bus stations. Now, some groups did stop after these protesters were attacked by mobs. Others chose to continue on. Now, what I'm going to show you is a map of a couple of the freedom rides. And what I did was I highlighted two routes. So we have CORE, that's in red. I don't know if you can see that. And we also have the SNCC routes that are in blue. All right? Now, with every map, let's go back to our map skills. Every map has a key or a legend. That's where you look to see what these symbols represent. So on this particular legend or this key, the route that is in red is CORE, as I said before, and the route that is in blue is SNCC. Now, here's my question to you. Let's get these dendrites going. Where did the CORE route start? All right, if you said it started in Washington, D.C., Ms. Tonetter, you are brilliant because it did start in Washington, D.C., all right? Now, the SNCC route started in Nashville, Tennessee, And as I said before, they started in the north and they traveled down to the south. Unfortunately, name the state where they had the most issues. Now, if you go back to your map legend, where you see a yellow sunburst, that's when somebody was arrested. And where you see it looks like an explosion with the red sparks coming out, that's when something ugly happened, all right? So back to my question. Which state gave these freedom riders the most issues? In the state of Alabama, that's where they had the most issues, all right? I mean, it is what it is. So you learn better, you know better, you do better. So that's where we are with that. So the fight continues. Now, the year is, we fast forward to 3 years later, 1963. That particular year, a whole lot of stuff was going down for whatever reason. It was just that year. Now, in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King had led a civil rights march in Birmingham. Now, he was arrested because he did not have a permit. Now, in this particular jail cell in Birmingham, that's where he had penned his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Around this time, other things were going on too. The Children's March, a lot of protesters were gathering in a park that was near the 16th Street Baptist Church. And police officers, law enforcement at the time, were releasing dogs and spraying water hoses, fireman water hoses, as in the kind that would peel your skin off. And this was publicized. And of course, the nation was like, this is a disgrace because all of this is going on. And as a matter of fact, the children that were involved in this march were not much older than you. In fact, some of them were younger than you. They just left school to participate in the march because they saw a bigger picture. We must have civil rights for everybody, or nobody can really enjoy their rights if everybody doesn't have the same type of rights. So anyway, these things were happening. The bombing of the 16th Street Church was happening at the same time. 4 little girls lost their lives and 14 people were injured. One other thing had happened also toward the end of '63, and that was the assassination of President John Kennedy. Now, I want to go ahead and show you this because one of my kids had said this. I know that if something happens to the president, the vice president is going to take over. But what happens to the vice president? Who's next? And so I pulled up this list of the order of presidential succession because, well, we're all citizens. You should know this. If something happens to the president, of course, the vice president takes over. And if something happens to the vice president, then the Speaker of the House takes over. And then after that, the Senate leader, you see where this is going. I'm not going to read all of this to you because it's Googleable. You can find it yourself, all right? But I just thought that this was noteworthy because a lot of people don't realize the succession. Now, in the history of our country, so far we have not gotten past the VP stage. Now, this has happened a total of 9 times in the history of the United States. Now, the highlighted areas, or the highlighted vice presidents, became president due to death, assassination, or resignation of the president. Now, FYI, assassination, big fancy word that means somebody famous was killed, all right? Now, before I move away from this, I want you to focus on Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the vice president to Abraham Lincoln, and Lyndon Johnson was the vice president to John F. Kennedy. Now, both of these vice presidents, their last name was Johnson. Coincidence? Perhaps. But as a special project, I want you to look at the similarities between John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln. A whole lot of parallels between those 2 presidents, and not just their vice president, not just because of their vice presidents. So anyway, President Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson stepped in. He was sworn in 1963. President Johnson basically picked up where President Kennedy left off. Now, a couple of FYIs about President Johnson. He was the opposite of President Kennedy. He was not a rich person. He didn't grow up in money. He grew up in Texas. And he was a teacher for a short period of time. And here's another fun fact. Everybody in his immediate family shared the same initials, LBJ, even the dog, which happened to be a beagle, Little Beagle Johnson. So I just thought that was noteworthy. I don't know if that was on purpose, but it is what it is. So anyway, he urged Congress to pass civil rights laws and later signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Activists continued to work for voting rights for African Americans in the South. One of the questions that you had to answer if you were trying to register in the South before the Voting Rights Act was passed was this: how many bubbles in a bar of soap? I don't know. But that was the kind of crazy questions that you had to answer just to suppress the voting rights of certain groups of people. Now, under Johnson's administration, these were the things that he was able to get in place. Besides the Civil Rights Act of 64, which he signed, he also signed the Voting Rights Act in 65. And he also got the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 65. That meant our public schools were going to be funded so that teachers could get paid and so that different programs could be in place, things like that. So that's kind of important to us. The Medicaid and Medicare Act bill was also passed in 65. How do you tell the difference? Medicaid, aid for the needy. Medicare, care for the elderly. Just gave you a mnemonic. He also had the Department of Housing and Urban Development Act passed as well, and that's to help Americans with housing issues. Now, in the civil rights movement, people had their own differing opinions. There were some people who felt like integration, maybe this is not necessarily the best idea, all right? Now, the leaders of the Black Power movement called for African American power, independence, and control of their own communities. One of the reasons why some people thought that this was not a good idea is because of this. Let's go back to the Brown versus Board of Education Act that was passed. When the schools were integrated with deliberate speed, typically what happened was this: the black students were shuttled to the white school. What happened to this black school? It closed, which meant that the teachers, the principal, the custodians, everybody that typically works at a school had to try to find employment outside of the community. And a lot of these leaders who felt like that integration was not the best idea, they felt like this is the beginning of the breakdown of our community, all right? Now, this young man here, Malcolm X, he was one of those leaders who was like, I'm not sure if this is a good idea, all right? He felt like that integration was not necessarily the best goal for civil rights. And he, along with other leaders, felt like blacks had a right to defend themselves by any means necessary. Let me put some clarity on that. He was not saying, oh, we need to take it to the streets. He was saying this: if our community is under attack and the law enforcement was either unwilling or unable to come in and help out, then the people of said community should have the right to protect themselves with the available resources. That's it. And other communities did this before law enforcement was official. They protected their communities. That's not a brand new concept. Couple of fun facts about Malcolm X. Now, his original name was Malcolm Little, but in the tradition of American slavery, it was the custom that the slave master would give his slaves his last name. Now, knowing this, Malcolm Little said, well, I know Little is not my original African name, so I'm going to drop Little and I'm going to put an X in its place, because in mathematics, X stands for the unknown. So that's why he chose the variable X, okay? Couple of other fun facts about Malcolm X. He, as a practicing Muslim, is required to go to Mecca, if you can afford it. And when he was there, he fellowshipped with Muslims of different races, of different walks of life, from all around the world. And after his trip from Mecca, he had decided, you know what, we can all work together to make our country a better place. Unfortunately, in 1965, he too was assassinated, so he was not able to see his ideas come into play. So the 60s, that was kind of a rough time in terms of civil rights. All right? So in summary, John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. The civil rights leaders continued to fight for equality for everybody. After Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson became president, and changes occurred in the civil rights movement throughout the 1960s. So, next week, we are going to be focusing on Section 3, Rights for Other Americans, which includes women, which includes Hispanic Americans. It also includes Americans that were disabled, things like that. Now, as I said before, if you didn't take any notes with my live lesson, you can catch this lesson on YouTube. So don't feel like you missed anything. You can go back and pause me, replay, forward me, what have you. I want to say there's a 12-hour loop. I'm not sure before you go to YouTube to watch this, but please, 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 ma'am, please, and sir, please feel free to go back and look at this. And I'm so glad, ma'am and sir, that you were able to join me, Grasshoppers. I hope that you are staying safe. My name is Mrs. Tonetter, and I hope to see you next Wednesday. Have a great day.